Okay, so my name is Rebecca Arvizu. I'm a board member here of ICUJP. I want to welcome everybody to our program. I just want to remind everybody that for the email that you got for this meeting has a list of our activities as well as an opportunity for you to donate. If there's links there for, we'd really appreciate your donations so we can keep on doing events like our Gitmo rally as well as these programs every Friday. We'd really appreciate your support with that. And moving on for next week's program, Carol Francis, can you tell us about the speaker for next week's program?
Yes, John Parker, who is one of the founders and co-directors of the Harriet Tubman Center, is going to be speaking on China, why we need to guard against China, the U.S. war moves against China. He has traveled to places where conflicts are going on to talk with people there. So he knows what he's doing. And he had just been in Africa at a conference. And one of the things that they talked about there was the role that China is playing in helping Africa develop. So it's everything we're not told about what's really happening in China.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carol Francis. And Rick also put in the chat the links to our link tree, and in there again are our events as well as links for you to donate.
I think this would be a good time for John to announce the rescheduled Guantanamo event.
Okay.
Okay, well, again, it was originally scheduled for January 11th, but there were the Altadena and Pacific Palisades fires. We're now scheduled for this coming Wednesday, February 5th at the Westwood Federal Building. There is a threat of rain, so as James Taylor once observed, we've seen fire and now we may see rain. So we're going to keep posted on that. Hopefully we'll be able to pull it off. If not, we may be putting it back a day.
And Rick, you'll put the latest flyer in the chat?
Yes. And that has an RSVP link, so,
Oh, good. All right. So at this point, why don't we move on to our reflection today given by Steve Rohde.
Thank you, Rebecca. There are so many demands for anyone that has a conscience these days. We're going to hear about one of those with our main speakers. I simply didn't want the week to pass without highlighting some of the worst of Donald Trump's recent executive orders and despicable racist comments, particularly yesterday in the face of the tragedy in Washington. His administration has launched a frontal attack on any efforts to combat the extent of discrimination in federal hiring, to lift up programs for affirmative action, for the recruitment of qualified people to serve in the federal government. He's got this boogeyman of DEI, and it's despicable and it needs to be called out. Today, briefly, it's only a reflection after all. I want to highlight one aspect of that in which he announced a new executive order to combat anti-Semitism. He has revived Executive Order 13899, which he issued originally on December 11, 2019, in his first term. Very briefly, this would elevate and install in federal law the very controversial definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, which is an intergovernmental agency made up of 34 countries, including Israel and the United States. They developed a definition of anti-Semitism to use for record keeping in Europe, but now it has spread, and U.S. Congress in the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is trying to install this definition. And even more troubling, it's 11 examples of anti-Semitism into the law of our federal law, and to use it in connection with the anti-discrimination laws that we have. The problem with the law is that many of the examples constitute obvious political speech protected by the First Amendment, which is not anti-Semitism. For example, among the examples, they would call it anti-Semitism to claim that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, to allegedly apply double standards by requiring the state of Israel to conduct itself in a way not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation, using the symbols and images associated with anti-Semitism to characterize Israel, or drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, one can agree or disagree with any of these examples. We can find them objectionable or offensive, or we can find them historically accurate, but they all represent political criticism of the state of Israel, a country that deserves to be subjected to the very same scrutiny, debate, and protest as any other country. And in that debate, Israel is not entitled to a free pass, insulating it from comment and criticism in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. This is a dangerous bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. It has been condemned by Jewish scholars. 66 UK Israeli academics have condemned it. 70 Democrats voted against it, including Jerry Nadler, a Jewish New York congressman, 1,200 Jewish university professors, including Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe, journalist and professor Peter Beinart, and Yale Law and History professor Samuel Moyn. So this is only a reflection. I am writing about this topic, and you will soon see my article published. I just want to raise the awareness in your minds to recognize this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism is an opening to conduct witch hunts on our college campuses, to penalize, fire, suspend students and faculty. We need to oppose the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and we need to condemn Donald Trump's executive order in this respect. ICUJP has been leading this call, along with Palestine Legal, Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Code Pink, and other organizations, and we'll continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with those groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yes, that was very informative, a good summary of where we are right now and the work we have ahead of us. So we'd like to move forward now and with our program and introduce our guests. And John worked hard to bring our guest to speak today. And of course, he's organizing our rally this Wednesday. So I've asked John to introduce our guest, and we agreed before the program that Andy will speak first. And take it away, John.
Well, Andy Worthington is the world's leading closed Guantanamo activist and an expert on the so-called war on terror. He's an investigative journalist, author, commentator, and public speaker. He's the author of the encyclopedic book, The Guantanamo Files, which tells the story of all 774 men and boys who have been held at Guantanamo. He's also the co-founder of Close Guantanamo and We Stand with Shaker, dedicated to freeing British citizen Shaker Amer, who was imprisoned in Guantanamo for 14 years and released in 2015. Andy, I hope you won't mind my mentioning that his mother just died this past Wednesday after suffering from dementia for 14 years. So, Andy, we all send our condolences. Michael Rapkin is a senior partner at the Marina Del Rey law firm of Rapkin and Associates, where his son is also a partner. He has been a real estate lawyer for 49 years and since 2005, a member of the Guantanamo Bar. Michael has had 2 clients in Guantanamo, both of whom were transferred out through habeas corpus litigation after undergoing torture and indefinite detention at the hands of the U.S. government. He has been to Guantanamo 3 times to meet his clients, and Michael also serves as an advocate for the homeless and is a civil rights lawyer. All right, guys, so today's subject is Guantanamo after 23 years and what to expect from Trump. So what can we expect? Is there any chance of it being closed in the next 4 years, or will Guantanamo prove to be too much of a bright and shiny object for someone like Trump? I guess, Andy, you can go first.
Thank you, John. Yes, well, that's the question. I suppose, first of all, let's reflect on where we were at on January the 20th, as Joe Biden was the 4th president to be in charge of the prison at Guantanamo Bay. And as was the case with Barack Obama, a huge amount of effort had to be put in, particularly towards the end of his administration, to secure the release of men who were held, who had long been approved for release unanimously by high-level U.S. government review processes, because almost every aspect of the running of Guantanamo is so shamefully dislocated from what we understand about how the law should work, that in Guantanamo you can be approved for release by high-level U.S. government review processes and languish there for 15 years, actually. But in most of the cases of the men held there under Biden for between 2 and 4 years without ever actually being released. And that's because the detention policy at Guantanamo, the ways in which these men were approved for release were through administrative review processes, which don't have a legal component, meaning there's no compunction on the US government to actually free people that it has said that it wants to free. They cannot go before a judge to demand that they be freed if the government, for whatever reason, decides that it doesn't want to free them or can't really be bothered to put the effort in. And that's actually what we spent the last couple of years of the Biden administration doing. So, just to roll back to the beginning, obviously, President Bush established this hideously lawless place on January 11th, 2002. He was in charge of the prison until he was defeated by Barack Obama. And as criticism of the prison mounted during his administration, he actually freed 2/3 of the people who were held there. Again, important to remember, these people were almost entirely released because of political pressure, not because of anything that involved the law, because the purpose of Guantanamo was to hold people indefinitely without charge or trial outside the reach of the US courts. And from the beginning, the intention was that if the United States felt that it had people there that it could accuse of serious crimes involving terrorism, that they would be able to use evidence derived through the use of torture and swiftly execute these people. That was Dick Cheney's plan. That didn't come true. The military commissions have been mired in problems ever since. But the main component of Guantanamo of indefinitely holding people without charge or trial is something that still remains. So, we remember, I'm sure all of us, that Obama promised to close Guantanamo and then 8 years later left office without having closed Guantanamo. He did free another 196 men from the prison. And then things started to get really sticky because then we had the first 4 years of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as I'm sure we remember, wanted to load the prison up with bad dudes. But even surrounded by the people that he was prevailed upon to recognize that sending people to Guantanamo is not helpful in any way. If people are accused of crimes involving terrorism, then the federal courts work perfectly well for their prosecution. But what Trump did was essentially to seal Guantanamo shut for 4 years. Just one man out of the 41 that he inherited from Obama was freed in that time, and that was a man who had agreed to a plea deal in the military commissions and was sent back to ongoing imprisonment in Saudi Arabia. So when President Biden took office, 40 men were still held at Guantanamo. In his first couple of years, he eventually got round to freeing 10 of these men, reducing the prison's population to 30. The last prisoner to be released until recently was in April 2023. So what then happened was that for those of us who were pushing for Guantanamo's closure, we had to spend 20 months trying to push the administration to release any of these 30 men who were still held, even though 16 of them had been approved for release. And what I was involved in as part of my campaigning was to, I set up monthly vigils for the closure of Guantanamo, which I'm glad to say have been taking place on the first Wednesday of every month for the last 2 years, in which John quite often holds a solo vigil in Los Angeles, which occasionally someone will take a photo of him. But these are vigils that take place across the US at various locations, and also in London and in Brussels and in Mexico City. And what we were doing throughout was pushing to try and raise awareness that the Biden administration was holding these men who had long been approved for release. And every month I would update a poster showing how long they had been waiting to be freed. But it wasn't until December, so what is now last month, it wasn't until last month that we finally saw some action. After 20 months, men were freed from Guantanamo in the dying days of the Biden administration. He released 15 men in total, of these men who had long been approved for release, and a couple of Malaysian men who had agreed to a plea deal, reducing the prison's population to 15 men. And we must be thankful that those releases took place, because there was no indication that the administration was that interested. And the particularly troubling aspect of this story, I think, really is that a number of Yemeni men at Guantanamo who cannot be sent back to their home country because of provisions that are inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act every year by Republicans, prescribe certain countries for the return of Guantanamo prisoners, Yemen being the most prominent. Biden had actually appointed a former ambassador, this tenacious woman called Tina Kadenow, to be in charge of transfers from Guantanamo. And she had arranged for these Yemeni men, 11 of them, to be resettled in Oman, where men from Guantanamo had previously been resettled under Obama. A plane was on the runway in October 2023, but we all know what also happened in October 2023. And it coincided with the backlash, an anti-Muslim backlash, shall we say, after the October 7th attacks in Israel, where the Biden administration didn't think the political optics were suitable for releasing Muslim men from Guantanamo, and so that resettlement plan was shelved. Tina Kadenow kept pushing at it, and eventually the release of these men just at the start of January was down to her tenacity. But unfortunately, Tina Kadenow herself died in October without seeing her plans come to fruition. But she is the person, I think, who we can credit most with these releases under Biden. And sadly, what never happened was any resolution for the release of 3 men long approved for release. One of these men is a Rohingya Muslim. When he was first brought to Guantanamo 23 years ago, the US authorities decided that he was from the UAE. He wasn't from the UAE. The best that we seem to have been able to establish over the years is that at some point he had a Pakistani passport, but he seems fundamentally to be stateless. A Rohingya Muslim whose origin is in Myanmar. The reason we know so little about him is because he has never engaged with the authorities. He never asked for a lawyer to represent him. He is essentially a ghost within the machinery of Guantanamo. And, you know, I think it's one of the many problems at Guantanamo is that you can be unrepresented in that place if the men held, for whatever reason, don't want anybody to be an intermediary between them and the United States authorities. So he is still held there, as are 2 other men who were approved for release under the Biden administration, but who no one could be bothered to find countries that would take them in. Again, both of these men from countries that where the US government is prohibited from sending them back home. One of them is a Somali man who was approved for release over 3 years ago, and another is a Libyan man who was approved for release over 2 years ago. There are other men held at Guantanamo who have never been charged with a crime, but they were never approved for release either by these administrative review processes that Obama established. One of them is Abu Zubaydah. One is a Libyan, and the other man is an Afghan called Mohammed Rahim. These are all men described as high-value detainees when they were brought to Guantanamo. In the first 2 cases, they were brought with 12 other high-value detainees from the CIA black sites in September 2006. Mohammed Rahim, the Afghan, was the last man brought to Guantanamo in March 2008. Abu Zubaydah, I'm sure most people will have heard about. He was the man for whom the CIA's post 9/11 torture program was first developed. At the time, when announcing his capture, I believe, if I recall correctly, George W. Bush described him as the number 3 in Al Qaeda. He was supposed to, you know, according to these claims by the Bush administration, you know, he was involved in 9/11. He was a major terrorist leader. In the years since, the United States has walked back from all of the grand claims that it made about Abu Zubaydah, but they have refused to recommend him for release, along with these two other men. And so they are also still held at Guantanamo, forever prisoners held without charge or trial, not even approved for release. In the case of the Afghan man, Mohammed Rahim, it is possible that we will see some movement under Donald Trump, because it sounds to me as though what we heard before he got into office is something that might appeal to him. There were talks underway to some extent between the US government and the Taliban about exchanging Mohammed Rahim for a number of US military personnel who are held by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that's a prisoner swap that I think we could possibly see. The other men who are held at Guantanamo are all caught up in one way or another in the broken military commission trial system, which has a fundamental problem in that the defense lawyers working for the men charged of crimes, including the 9/11 attacks in Guantanamo, are trying to secure information from the government so that they can have something that would resemble a fair trial. But that's completely impossible because these men were all tortured in CIA black sites before their arrival at Guantanamo. And the fundamental truth about torture and justice is that the two are incompatible. If you torture somebody, you really have excluded the possibility of being able to deal with them in the courts adequately. And the problem on this front is something that the Biden administration really didn't help with in its last months in office. Prosecutors at Guantanamo realized at least 2 years ago that their ability to successfully prosecute the men accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks had been completely broken through the use of torture. And so they began negotiations with the defense teams, also involving the convening authority at Guantanamo for the military commissions, who is a military official appointed by the Secretary of Defense to handle everything to do with the military commissions. They negotiated for 2 years to reach plea deals with 3 of the men accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which were announced at the end of summer. Was it the end of July, the end of August? I can't remember now. That they had agreed to a plea deal, that in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, they would be held forever. They would be in prison for life, but they wouldn't be executed, and they would provide an explanation for closure about what actually happened on 9/11 and what they actually did. As soon as the defense secretary realized that this had happened, having somehow failed to have noticed for all of these years, he claimed that he had the power to rescind the plea deals, that the authority that he had given to Susan Escalier, the convening authority at Guantanamo, that he could overrule her. There was no basis for this presumption. What it seems to very clearly have been is an insistence within the Biden administration, as there, I think, has been an insistence within every administration in charge of Guantanamo, that there must be punishment through execution for the men accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks, and that no reality can get in the way of that. Even the reality of the conclusion that was reached by everyone involved in it, that it is impossible to have successful prosecutions in these cases, and that therefore plea deals are the only viable solution, and the only solution that will bring closure for the families of the 9/11 victims who have been waiting for over 2 decades for something that would do this. And so unfortunately, this was strung out through the last months of the Biden administration. The judge in the military commission trial at Guantanamo said that the defense secretary had no right to claim that he could overrule the convening authority. The a military appeals process concluded the same thing, and the Biden administration, as Trump was looming, decided to appeal through the federal court system, and so we didn't get the conclusion that we could have reached before Biden left office. And the plea deals are ongoing as to, the appeals court is now looking to see whether they are going to agree with the government. It didn't look as though they were going to do, in which case the plea deals that have been arranged will go ahead. Although I suppose all of us must be wondering whether there is anything that the Trump administration and the new defense secretary can do to sabotage this. I suspect not. I think that if the appeals court rules that the Lloyd Austin overstepped his authority in this case, as it seems clear that he did, that this case will continue. The plea deals will continue. And as much as any US government can bring a wrecking ball to the people held without charge or trial at Guantanamo, those who are in the military commission system are within an actual legal system, however broken its operations may be. It is a legal system. It is the law. So, we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. The other thing, if I'm not going on for too long, the Biden administration, fortunately, I think, was thwarted in its dying days, was that it attempted to send back to Iraq a man who had agreed to a plea deal in Guantanamo, who is the most profoundly disabled prisoner who has ever been held there. He has a degenerative spinal disease, which has left him almost entirely disabled. He has had 7 operations at Guantanamo that haven't resolved it. And that may in part be due to the fact that adequate medical equipment simply is not available at Guantanamo. But there is a total ban on any Guantanamo prisoner being brought to the US mainland for any reason, imposed by the Republicans under Obama and maintained every year since. Under the terms of the plea deal, the United States government was required not to send him back to Iraq. But the deal that the Biden administration came up with and tried to push through at the last minute was that they were indeed going to send him back to Iraq, where it was almost certain that he would then be imprisoned and would not be given the lifelong medical care that is his right and that he absolutely requires. A judge blocked that at the last minute. So that didn't happen. That's most of the people that are still held in Guantanamo that I've discussed. I should say that one of the men who was accused in the 9/11 trial, there were 5 in total. 3 of them agreed to the plea deals. One of them didn't agree to a plea deal, and his lawyers are involved in separate negotiations that are ongoing. The other man, a couple of years back, was ruled as mentally unfit to stand trial because of the torture to which he was subjected in the black sites, which has rendered him psychotic. He literally is now an uncategorizable prisoner in Guantanamo. He is, in the common parlance of people held indefinitely without charge or trial, he is now a forever prisoner. But no one has bothered to resolve what the situation is at Guantanamo for a man who is mentally unfit to stand trial. And who is he? What is his status? The Biden administration failed to address it, and so we simply don't know. The other 2 men, I think, are the last ones that are left, are Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri, the accused mastermind of the USS Cole bombing, whose pretrial hearings are endlessly grinding on without any conclusion, and Ridwan Isamuddin, also known as Hambali, the alleged mastermind of the Southeast Asian al-Qaeda offshoot, who is charged, but we don't know what's going to happen in his case. But that's the messy situation at Guantanamo. There are only 15 men still held. I would not say that there is any possibility that anyone in the United States government could claim that any of those men are being treated fairly, even though, we're looking at 23 years of this horrendous place operating. apart from the my identification of a possible deal for Mohammed Rahim, the Afghan, in a prisoner exchange, I would be surprised if the Trump administration wants to do anything. I would say, I suppose, if people wanted to push on something, they could try and point out what an absolutely scandalous waste of money running Guantanamo is. It costs $500 million a year. Most of that, about 80% of that, is spent on the military commissions. So it is possible that that might be a way of approaching it, but I would fear that we're in for 4 years where the best that we can do is to maintain pressure to try and make sure that people don't forget about Guantanamo, at the war on terror prison. Obviously, I'm sure we'll be talking at some point about the new card that Donald Trump has played, where he wants to establish a migrant prison for 30,000 people, not connected to the war on terror prison, but in the naval base at Guantanamo. I hope I've covered everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And actually, that was perfect. You didn't need me to give you the 5-minute warning. That was great. Okay, let's transition now to Michael.
Thank you very much. First and foremost is John Crampner invited me to speak because it was possible that Andy, due to his mother's illness, was not going to be able to be here for all or part of it. As it turns out, with what Andy just said, I'm not needed in essence, but I am going to make some comments and try not to replicate anything that Andy said. And in addition to that, probably spend half my time talking about the Trump's call for 30,000 migrants and how that is going to affect Guantanamo and its closing. But Andy, I don't think in this universe anybody could say more, no more than you do. I'd like to think Carol Rosenberg is right there at the top, but you covered it, and you know each and every one of the 15 remaining people. Speaking of the 15 remaining people, we have to keep in mind that as of January 11, 2002, and thereafter, we had close to 250 detainees. And President Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld called these people the worst of the worst. In order to be released, it meant that the prisoners had to be, quote unquote, no threat to the United States. So the government, going all the way back to George Bush, has been wrong in about 98% of the cases, because we start with about 750, and we're now down to 15. Some of those 15, as Annie mentioned, includes the masterminds of the 9/11 attacks, but even they cannot be finally adjudicated because of the failed military commission system. What they need, what the country needs to try to close Guantanamo is a real United States federal court to bring justice to the victims, the survivors, and of course to the people who have been mistreated, indefinitely detained, and tortured since January 2002. And I might add, my first client was one of the first 20 arrivals at Guantanamo. It opened on January 11, as has been discussed. And Mohammed Ghanem was one of the first 20 that arrived on day one. And it took him until about 2013 before he can be released. And I can tell you that much of what came out of him, we had to go into court in the United States District Court in Washington, D.C., and the judge there excluded lots of evidence because it was taken by torture. So to me, there are two questions here. The question one is, can Guantanamo be closed? And number two is, will it be closed? Let me try to answer the second question first. No. With Trump in office, again, the legal black hole, which remains a stain on our country's humanity, will not be closed. First, let's put aside Trump's recent declaration just 2 or 3 days ago that he intends to place 30,000 immigrants who are currently on United States soil into Guantanamo. Keep in mind that Trump, in his 4 years, pledged, this is during his first term, that he intended to keep the facility open. And as Andy pointed out, during that 4 years, only one person was resettled. In other words, when Barack Obama left as president, I believe there were 41 left, because at the time that Joe Biden took over, there were 40, and he reduced it to 15. So my calculation is that during Trump's first 4 years, one person was transferred out of Guantanamo, and that was not by his doing. My belief, my recollection is there was a deal already in place, and he had to fulfill that previous agreement. What I also want to say that has not yet been mentioned is that we cannot just blame the presidents and the administrations. There's another reason that Guantanamo has not been closed, and why I don't think it'll be closed in the foreseeable future. And the blame is to be placed on our United States senators and our congresspeople. Why? Because they are the ones which have passed legislation years ago that will not permit any Guantanamo detainees from entering United States soil. What does that mean? It means that if we want to do justice, and quick and fair justice, we need to try these detainees in a court, not the military commission. They could be tried in our court, but the legislation passed prevents, also what Andy had to say was that no Guantanamo detainee is allowed to enter United States soil. First, to be tried. Second, assuming they plead guilty or they're sentenced after a trial or a hearing, they cannot be imprisoned. And in the United States, we have the most secure facility anywhere, located in Florence, Colorado. So the detainees cannot be tried here, even though we've had well in excess of 500 terrorists since 9/11 tried and convicted in US federal courts. They cannot be imprisoned here, so that doesn't help us to clean out Guantanamo, nor can they receive needed medical care. The other thing is why it's not going to be closed, in my opinion, is that there are very few countries that are willing to resettle the remaining detainees, including the fact that the United States has been reluctant to repatriate prisoners to their home country because the home countries do not want these people. For example, just think about in Biden's last days where he was so successful in transferring out 11 Yemenis. Did they go to their home country? No. Where did they go? They went to Oman, a little country in the Middle East. The question then is, can Guantanamo be closed? And theoretically, the answer is yes. Let's think about it. 3 of them, as Andy mentioned, have been cleared, and they've been cleared for transfer years ago. I say release them. 3 others have never been charged after spending well over a decade in Guantanamo. Release them. 2 of them have been convicted and sentenced. Well, I think we could pay other countries to imprison them and pay them healthily, because it's a lot cheaper than paying in excess of about $500 million per year. And I recently read where there's about 800 military and civilians that are overseeing the detention center in Guantanamo. So it has to be cheaper if we can pay another country to imprison them. Even better if we had legislation that would allow those serving time in Guantanamo to be imprisoned in a prison in the United States. But like I said earlier, that ain't going to happen unless and until legislation allows Guantanamo detainees to enter United States soil. When we have Elon Musk and Donald Trump talking about cutting $2 trillion or more from our budget, they should probably consider the fact that, at least as of just a few years ago, it would cost $38,000 per prisoner, per detainee, to put them into the most secure facility we have in Colorado, versus spending tens and tens of millions of dollars per detainee. What a great way to cut the budget instead of Medicare or Medicaid and other things that we've been reading about. 6 detainees have been in the failed and troubled military commission system, which in over at least 10 or 12 years, nothing's happened. And we appear to be, I believe, years away from trying its first prisoner because of all the delays. And I believe that upon any successful trial, the matter will be appealed because of the improprieties, the illegalities of the military system. The military commission has made up its own rules as time has passed. As Andy also discussed, there were plea bargains that were worked out for some of these people, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of the attacks. They agreed to plead guilty, accept life sentences in exchange for the government taking the death penalty off the table. But the Secretary of Defense, Austin, revoked the deal, and we hope that that's put back on the table. Of the 15 detainees that are left, 4 of them, the government has thus far refused to transfer and has been unable and unwilling to put them on trial because they have a lack of evidence. A criminal defense lawyer, of which I am not, would say, let's give these people the right to a speedy trial. And 23 years or so is not exactly a speedy trial, or release them. In other words, let's translate this. The government is saying we can't try them because we don't have the evidence. So therefore, we're going to continue to indefinitely detain them, which is its own form of torture. So bottom line is, Gitmo theoretically can be closed, but with Trump, it shall not be closed. Now, let me explain with the 30,000 migrants and how that's going to affect the closing of Guantanamo. In the words of a famous New York Yankees catcher by the name of Yogi Berra, he said, "This is deja vu all over again." And what I mean by that is that, as I explained earlier, Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld said, we now have the worst of the worst. And now we have Trump's new border czar calling the migrants worst of the worst. In addition to that, our friend Trump has called the migrants and asylum seekers criminal threats, dangerous animals, and trash. If we review Trump's history on dealing with migrants and asylum seekers, as his latest threat should not be too shocking. His threat being, let's throw them into Guantanamo, 30,000 of them. Because during Trump's first 4 years as president, he worked tirelessly to deny asylum seekers their legal rights and to undermine the rule of law. In fact, just days or a day before before Biden was inaugurated, and of course Trump refused to attend that inauguration, Trump on January 18, 2021 the court issued a restraining order to block Trump's administration's attempt to prevent asylum seekers from accessing the U.S. asylum process by denying them the right to process their asylum applications at the ports of entry. It's at the ports of entry where asylum seekers are supposed to go to seek asylum. Why is Trump doing this? Well, first, as part of his trying to secure the popularity of his MAGA fans, he's attempting to paint immigrants as threats in the United States and to fan anti-immigrant sentiment. He wants to cast immigrants as terrorists. So the question is, can Trump deport people who are now living in the United States to Guantanamo? The answer is yes. In fact, currently there is a migrant facility there. I didn't know that. Andy, did you know that previous to today in Guantanamo, there has been a migrant facility? I'm not talking about years ago with the Haitians in the early 90s, today.
Yeah. I mean, not holding that many people, Michael, but yes.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Tell you a little bit of research on that. But just late last year, the International Refugee Assistance Project cited testimony from refugees that the conditions at the Guantanamo facility were inhumane and unlawful. There was undrinkable water, exposure to open sewage, poor medical care, and schooling facilities for children. What bothers me so much about it is this is my country, this is our country, and this is what we've been doing since January 2002. Before all these 30,000 migrants, or even if it's 5,000 migrants, are to be deported to Guantanamo, Congress will need to fund the expansion. Are they going to be able to do it with who's in Congress now when Trump has, when King Trump, I should say, has all of his people running the House and the Senate? He'll get his money. So that's that. Now, what are the legal and non-legal impediments to deporting up to 30,000 people? First, Trump said, we have 30,000 beds. Not true, not even close. Would Trump house men only? Because if women and children are going to be there, that's going to make housing challenges more difficult. We also don't know how many migrants will be housed, what kind of construction there'll be, what construction will be required, and what the operational costs will be. But it has to be extremely expensive. But there's serious due process considerations. And I want to begin with what is not obvious to all but a small percentage of Americans, which is this. All of Trump's victims that are what he mistakenly calls the worst of the worst I'm talking about these 11 million undocumented workers, many of which he wants to take to Guantanamo. They're going to be taken from the United States mainland, and therefore they're going to be entitled to the full collection of legal rights, which are granted by our Constitution. Of the approximately 750 detainees that have been in and out of Guantanamo, they have all not come from US soil. They have come from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries where they served time in these black sites before coming to Guantanamo, but not one of them was taken from US soil. So now what this means is that lawyers are going to be allowed to come in to represent these prisoners from day one, unlike originally when the first prisoners were arrived on January 11, 2002. It was not until June 2004 that the US Supreme Court, in a case called Rasul versus Bush, said these people have a right to a lawyer, and right around that time, it was deemed by the Supreme Court that these detainees had a right to habeas corpus, which is how I got involved. So not only are they going to be allowed in, but they're going to be allowed real US courts to serve them rather than the kangaroo courts, which I refer to as the Guantanamo Military Commission. There won't be the secrecy that we had for too many years. I hope that Trump cannot hold immigrants indefinitely, that he cannot deport people without hearings, that he will not be able to deny asylum seekers the right to apply to legally live in the United States. But we have to remember that Guantanamo is a legal black hole in an offshore prison site intended to keep people out of sight and out of mind. And yes, human rights does not allow this, but you could believe that Trump is going to do his best to keep people out of sight and out of mind. Otherwise, he wouldn't send them to Guantanamo. Due process has additional considerations. For example, indefinite detention, which means not only that detainees will be removed from their family, but it could take years hidden away in Guantanamo until a country agrees to accept them for resettlement. Also, expect that these immigrants will receive what has been going on with the detainees on the war side, which is ill treatment, potentially torture, limited access to judicial protection. In Guantanamo, detainees would have less consular legal services than they currently have if they're on US soil, because they're not going to have all these immigration lawyers at the border and helping them with asylum, even though that has been an issue. So I would just say in conclusion, it's been almost 20 years since I visited Guantanamo Bay's detention and torture center. I can't say I miss the place, but I might need to return while I can practice my Spanish with my Latino friends and hopefully have the opportunity to sue King Trump. Thank you.
Wow, powerful words from both our speakers today. Thanks so much. Yeah, I learned there's more atrocity going on than I thought, than I knew about. So, okay, so this is the time where we can, and you're both perfect timing, didn't need me. we have our regular time for questions. And I see Steve has his hand up, and then so I'll go to Steve and then go to Rick.
I just want to thank both of you. Andy, the idea that you are out there, that you wake up every morning to do this work, and you've done it literally every day and every year since this abominable place opened, is a human rights celebration, and we cannot thank you enough. It's just remarkable that you do it, that you have your vigils, that you stay on top of this. I just want you to know from this ragtag group of activists out here in Los Angeles that we are so proud of you and we're so grateful to you. This audience knows me. I usually save this for later, but you are now a card-carrying member of ICUJP. Your dues, your lifetime dues are fully paid up, and we just appreciate you so much. Michael Rapkin, you said something early on that you didn't need to be here. Well, you did, and you complimented and added so much dimension to what Andy did. And I'm going to turn this into a question by saying, I'm an optimistic guy. I'm a glass half full. I think the threat to deport 30,000 immigrants to Guantanamo is an opening for all of us to demand the closure of Guantanamo. I think Trump has put Guantanamo Bay back in the headlines. He has elevated national attention that all of us have had for 24 years, but others haven't. So I think we need to build on this. We need to call on our allies in the immigrant rights community to say, we warned you, having a pre-existent, not warned you in a negative sense, but we have sounded this alarm. We told you that a permanent pre-existing prison outside of the United States is a threat to human rights and civil rights. You, Michael, have added this dimension that now we've got people in the United States that could be threatened with that kind of transfer. And you said it, but I want to emphasize for our audience, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights doesn't talk about citizens when it comes to due process. And the Fifth and Sixth and 14th Amendment, it talks about persons and people. And every one of these undocumented individuals is currently protected by the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That's the incisive point that Michael was making. And the notion that he will step up to this once again is very, very appealing. Michael, and maybe Andy, and maybe there's a joint article here, but what you said, Michael, and I know you were using some notes, I cannot urge you enough to convert your remarks today into an article, because you have raised new points that I think the public needs to hear from. I promise you that Dick and Sharon at LA Progressive will publish that article tomorrow. I think the Daily Journal in our legal world would publish it. I think you have gathered up such important information, and it may be combined with an update from Andy in terms of the dreadful conditions and situation at Guantanamo. So I beg both of you to think about collaborating and publishing something on this as soon as possible. And let me put a question mark on this by putting to you, Michael, have you yet heard of any it was our dear friend Michael Ratner of beloved memory who organized some of the first legal teams out of the Center for Constitutional Rights to deal with what was emerging in Guantanamo Bay. Have you begun to hear any legal cooperation to prepare immediately to go after the executive order to transfer immigrants to Guantanamo?
No, I have not. And I think this is so new and much needs to be done by the Trump administration to organize this, to get the funds in order to make up thousands of beds, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer is no. I have not heard of any such actions having yet taken place. But if you do, or anybody does, I'd like to know, because I am pledging to be on that first plane to Guantanamo, despite the fact I am not an immigration law expert, but we can learn that. And I know enough about due process. And if I may, and I'm going to digress for just a second, but I want to show you sort of how dire this is, even looking at due process. In addition to representing a couple of detainees beginning in 2005 until about 2014, when the last was released, I was involved in a friend of the court brief, and it had to do with the Religious Freedom Reformation Act, where every federal prisoner had the right to practice their religion, no matter what the religion was. And the government said, wait a minute, in Guantanamo, you're off limits. We're not talking about protection there under. And there was a decision in the friend of the court brief. It was a dissent. And in the dissent, I have it in my closet here. The dissenter said, under the due process clause, Guantanamo detainees are not, and I'm going to quote, human beings. Sad. This is, and it's not going to get any better with Trump and his administration and the border czar, et cetera, and the DOJ. So that's that. So.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for the question and the answer.
If
So,
I could just
yeah, go ahead.
say something as well, because thank you very much for all of your thoughts on that, Michael. And obviously, this is early days. We don't know. For everything that Trump has got planned, he has to get Congress to give him money in eye-watering amounts. And what worries me actually the most, after everything that you were saying, what worries me the most is that their plan for this will be to try and remove any rights from people that they move to this migrant prison in Guantanamo, if they can get the funding, if they can set it up. Because the whole point is about refusing to recognize that undocumented migrants in the United States on the US mainland have any rights. Everything that they're trying to put into place now is about the removal of people from the United States without any form of due process. So it's something we all have to work on. I mean, I've actually been trying to read everything that's been written recently. I'm just in the early process of trying to discuss with experts within the United States, because in the UK, we have much more, I think, technically, of an adherence to the principle of non-refoulement, where you are not allowed to be arbitrarily sent back to a country where you face the risk of torture or other forms of abuse. And yet, when I look at the history of the United States, whoever's the president, of hundreds of thousands of people being deported from the United States every year, there seems to be a very gray area about any protections under the law to prevent people from being summarily deported from the United States. It's a kind of gray area, and everybody who has expertise on this is going to need to bring it together, because absolutely what the Trump administration is intending to do, and we are a long way off from it yet. Congress has to approve money that has to be then put in place. But their intention would be to make sure that the people they deport to Guantanamo, to this migrant prison, would be as fundamentally stripped of rights as the Guantanamo prisoners. That's the real danger. If there's any chance that they have to send people there with rights, where lawyers would be allowed to represent them, then that would make things very difficult. So I think we need to be fearful of and alert about the extreme position that they want to take, which is that they intend to try and strip people of all rights as human beings.
Rebecca, taking chair's privilege, one of the strengths of ICUJP is bringing allies together. And right on this screen, we've got Andy and Michael. And I'm hearing collaboration as Andy, if you hear of any moves to create a legal team because of your contacts, and likewise with Michael, we're going to be a feeding ground for that to ensure that you are in touch with each other, that organizationally ICUJP can support that. And we should be in touch, Michael, with Vince Warren and at Center for Constitutional Rights and others because you got to get ready sooner than later. You've got to draft the legal arguments, because as soon as Trump makes a move, and we've seen this already with birthright citizenship and the freezing of federal money, you've got to be in court the next day. So I'm just encouraging that this is not the last of it, and that we build on this collaboration among you two to move forward.
Agree. Bringing the allies together. Okay, we got Rick, Carol Francis, and then Dawn. So Rick.
Thank you. Andy and Michael, thank you very much for doing this. I'm looking in the chat, and I think one of the big things and one of the big places we can start is just letting people know, our friends and family, do you know that there's still prisoners in Guantanamo? I would say conservatively, maybe 90% of the people would probably think it's closed already. And that kind of silence and that kind of engineered ignorance is part of the process. So the more that we talk about it, the more that people understand how horrible this is. The second thing I wanted to very briefly ask you about is that in the beginning years of Guantanamo and its transition to a place to hold alleged terrorists, not even actual proven terrorists, it turned out that one of the big factors was the amount of reward that was given for each of these people that are being held there. I guess somewhere between $3,000 and $25,000. And there were a few people that were rounded up where they were just brought in because some warlord or somebody wanted to get the cash. I wanted to see if either of you can elaborate on how big a percentage that was, and and how to maybe prevent that kind of thing from happening if they try and transfer this into holding other people in this country.
Yeah, it was Donald Rumsfeld who led the brigade. It was Donald Rumsfeld who pronounced that he was going to be, and in fact, it happened, that he dropped from the sky or caused people to drop from the sky flyers that said, "Get rich beyond your wildest dreams." And they were dropping, I had heard, between 5,000 and up to 25,000, very close to what you said, Rick. And so a lot of the people that were picked up in these bounties, where in Afghanistan you had villages and one villager would turn in somebody else from another village. That was one way that it happened, and they got paid because of these. Can you imagine having $5,000 or $10,000 and you're living in Afghanistan? It costs you maybe, I don't know, $200-300 a month, and you're living very well. But that's not the only way that people got picked up. A lot of them, such as one of my clients, they were caught way off the battlefield, no weapons, walking across from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and they got picked up. And that's another way that this was done shamefully. As one general said, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So.
And another aspect of the story is that in his autobiography in 2006, President Musharraf boasted how, in exchange for handing over hundreds of alleged terrorists to the United States, that Pakistan received millions of dollars. So he committed to text in a published book the fact that that he took a bribe from the United States to hand over people who could be dressed up as terrorists. You know, the scale of it we will never really know. It's one part of a story where the presumption of innocence and also the ability to recognize that you can make mistakes was completely done away with by the United States government after 9/11. I mean, no screening, no adequate screening process for the men who were sent to Guantanamo, no competent tribunals under Article 5 of the Geneva Conventions to separate civilians from combatants, unlike the quite startling example of the first Iraq War, when 1,200 competent tribunals were held from people who said, I'm a farmer, you caught me by mistake. And in 3/4 of those cases, the US government recognized that the US military recognized that it caught people by mistake and sent them home. In 3/4 of the cases, that's how easy it is to round up the wrong people in wartime. And imagine doing away completely with that when it came to Guantanamo. So that absolutely, I mean, there were so many aspects of that story that were so abominably incompetent that it's why the prison ended up full of Mickey Mouse prisoners, as one of the early commanders of Guantanamo said. And it is, to this day, I genuinely think, one of the reasons why no US government has wanted to admit the scale of the incompetence when it came to Guantanamo. If we remember back to the early days of Obama, when he held a review process to establish how many of the 240 men he'd inherited from George W. Bush should be freed and how many should be put on trial, I almost ended up thinking at that point that they had discussions about how many people they could present to the public as dangerous to defend the legitimacy of what had happened. Because, 2/3 of those men were approved for release by Obama, but 48 were regarded as too dangerous to release, but they didn't have evidence to put them on trial. And 36 were recommended for being put on trial. And that kind of persisted throughout the entire Obama administration, whittled away at by the periodic review boards that he eventually established. But each step of the way throughout this 23-year-old history has been chipping away so resolutely at anything that would underpin any notions that the United States government held more than a handful of people at Guantanamo who ever posed any kind of genuine threat to the United States.
Thank you so much. We have 2 questions left, but we're running close to time. So, running out of time. So, I'm going to ask Dawn and Carol Francis to give their questions back to back. First Carol Francis and then Dawn.
Yeah,
And then our speakers can answer both of the questions.
yeah.
They ask.
I'm listening to you. I'm wondering about the global opposition to this through Latin America, particularly the countries where the immigrants come from, or Haiti. The possibility of having a global movement. And in the United States, both the documented and citizen Latinos who may be legal here, but maybe sons and daughters. It seems like there are an awful lot of them as opposed to those who had ties to the people in Guantanamo, to allow this to not be on the streets protesting with us. And it seems like it can unite them with those anti-war people and also those people who are struggling for medical and housing and other human rights. It seems like the expense that our taxes would go to this should be able to unite us. I'm wondering, who are those that are targeted of the immigrants? Is it just, we know that you came here illegally and they're going to be untried for having crossed the border, or the people that are suspect for something else? And also, as a European, what is the mood in Europe about this?
Oh, hey, my question is this: what does the International Court of Justice say about Guantanamo Bay? Is there any push from them? And that's my question.
Andy, could you answer that last question about the International Court of Justice? I don't think I can give a good answer.
I've just been trying to think about that, and I don't think that there's been anything within the ICJ. I mean, it would have to involve a complaint by a member nation against another member nation, and I don't recall anything that's come up. But
I would just add to try to coordinate both questioners that outside the United States, there is basically global opposition to what the United States has done going back to 2002. Countries in Western Europe especially have been opposed to what the different administrations have done, and they have not condoned Trump's first 4 years as to him doing virtually nothing to help the Guantanamo detainees. And so they are not in favor of continuation of what's going on. And that's why it's a stain on our humanity. The United States does not look good and is not admirable as a country to many people looking at what we've perpetuated for 23 years. Torture between the Geneva Convention and other international laws across the board have condemned the torture. They have condemned the indefinite detention. So I think that's a collective answer.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just say as well, I mean, I would very much hope that there's going to be an incredible coming together of Latin American representatives of groups, because these are the people who are clearly the most affected. Is Central and South America and the Caribbean, but you know. The rest of the world is going to be appalled about this. I mean, we know that unfortunately, what we've seen from the last 10 years is a massive move towards the far right in almost every country in the West. If they're not actually in power, then they're increasingly grabbing the attention of more and more of the population. It's true everywhere. Trump is taking this now to unprecedented depths of horror. If he gets his way, and that's going to attract a lot of opposition from a lot of people around the world. But clearly, as I'm now speaking to an online collection of Americans, I would say that I speak for everybody who's analyzing this from abroad. That unlike his first term, where he was primarily preoccupied with stopping certain groups of people from getting into America, he has now declared a war on the American people. He's declared a war on employees of the federal government who don't think in the right way. He has declared a war on every single undocumented immigrant within the United States, on a scale that is really genuinely depraved and shocking. And so, you know, I'm sure that your allies abroad will be doing whatever we can to express our support for you. But I also am interested in working with everyone as much as possible to help with this vast struggle against just the most monstrous injustice. You know, I know that some of this is performative. I do genuinely think that when he goes to Congress, even with the compliance of both houses, what he's talking about is hundreds of billions of dollars that he wants to conjure up for his malevolence that that I don't think is actually achievable. But it's extremely dangerous times, and I can only particularly express my solidarity right now.
Rebecca, do we have 2 minutes for an additional comment from me?
We have 1.5 minutes.
I would like to thank the expert on international law, Don, for bringing up the International Criminal Court. If South Africa can file a petition against Israel for what it's doing in Gaza, then any number of countries could file a proceeding against the United States, and we may find a friendly petitioner in Cuba to be a co-petitioner against the United States for the atrocities that are occurring in Guantanamo Bay on its property under its 99-year lease. So I think we're actually on to something. And when you get international uproar and the threat to send immigrants to Guantanamo, you can then raise all of the issues both of you have talked about this morning. I think, Andy, you should begin to prepare a declaration cataloging the human rights violations, and you would be an expert witness in such a proceeding to document what has gone on at Guantanamo. And, you know, we may actually be able to foment. I'm a little surprised that for 24 years, no movement has seen a vehicle to drag the United States before the ICJ on this. But I think we're onto something, and I'm grateful to everybody here.
Okay. Wow, great. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of you at our rally as we do the work to address this developing area and throw some light around it, because it really needs it right now. These are dark times. So I don't want to be so pessimistic. So, before this is the time to call for general announcements. I almost forgot. Are there any general announcements? I'd just like to briefly mention that our speaker next week, Dave Parker, he's executive director, I believe, of the Harriet Tubman Center. And they are doing a rally at the Israeli consulate next Tuesday on February 4th at noon to protest Netanyahu's visit to Washington. So we'll look forward to hearing from him on that when he speaks with us on Friday. So now is the time where we uplift those who need light. And Dick, can I ask you to lead us in this prayer circle? We try to now, thanks to Doc Ruby, to avoid calling it a closing circle, but it's actually a prayer circle uplifting those who need it. So does anybody have names that you would like to submit into the circle? I would like to submit all of those who are still in Guantanamo, as well as those that have been, are still detained by the Trump administration and the prior Biden administration at our southern border or in our prisons in our name.
I wish Andy were at the screen, because I want to bring his mother into this circle.
Yes.
And I wish I could ask him her name and whether she was an inspiration to his human rights work throughout his life. But certainly she is here and present with us, and her spirit is with us.
I would like to up Della Porter, who is I'm a radio host on Monday nights, and our host mother, Della Porter, has been hospitalized for over 3 weeks now, and we're just hoping that she can recover and everything stabilize, and that she can leave the hospital better than she entered.
Anybody else?
I'd like to say that, has it only been like 10 days or something since somebody got inaugurated? But, it's this feels like a couple years now. But I just wanted to say for everybody, the purpose is to make you feel overwhelmed. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is to walk a straight line in the storm, but eventually you get to the calm center. And I think we have to think about that and be steady. That's the big thing.
Andy, when you stepped away, this is our circle that we bring people in who we've lost, who are struggling. And I brought into this circle your mother. If you would name her, and I asked if she was an inspiration to you in your human rights work, and just tell us a few things about her.
Well, I'm very sorry that I stepped away there. I'm afraid in a long discussion like this, I had to go to what you guys call the restroom. So
the loo.
The loo. My mum was indeed an inspiration to me, actually. Her name was Sonia. Her background was in Northern working class Methodism, and that particular background is one that was extremely concerned with taking from the Bible from the Gospels, from the New Testament aspects of life, where you should be concerned for the underdog, and where you should be concerned about social justice. So I think if you can look at what I've been doing, then it very much had an influence on me. You know, she was a kind, bright, intelligent woman who was engaged in these kinds of issues. And that's why it was so sad to see her so cruelly taken away by the illness that you know she suffered with for the last 14 years of her life. Many other people will have experiences of it. It really is a dreadful transfer. It's a dreadful removal of who people were. You know, for us to discuss what happens to people through those processes is something else. But she's you know, she no longer was the person that she had been, who had been so full of life, and just really an everyday decent person. You know, I've been particularly reminded, and perhaps that's what we all need to remember at the moment, is that the world is made up overwhelmingly, I would say, actually, of everyday decent people. And what we face in our lives, and it seems to be increasingly so over the last, particularly I would say the last decade, is that power is in the hands of people who don't have those values, and they are trying to make life miserable or worse for so many of us. But we are the majority. Fundamentally decent people are the majority. So we have to believe in ourselves, and we have to stick together.
Andy, thank you for sharing a few words about Sonia. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. And I'm just going to go out on a limb that she thinks you are exactly where you should be today, talking to this group. We hope it helps your grief and coming through this difficult time to turn yourself to exactly the kind of work that I'm sure she was so proud of.
Absolutely, Steve. Yeah, thank you. That's very moving that you asked about her. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.